In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer, Sanctifier. Amen. I want to thank your rector and my longtime friend, Kelly Walpole, for asking me to be with you today on the feast day of South Carolina reformer and martyr, William Alexander Guerry. Today, we remember and honor a native son of South Carolina who believed that all of God's children should be ministered unto, regardless of local customs and laws, who was unflinching in his beliefs, who tried, alas, unsuccessfully to persuade his fellow Episcopalians to change their minds, who in terms of statistics that all dioceses and the national church certainly count on, members, finances, governance, all of those administrative things, he was one of the most successful bishops in the history of 20th century South Carolina, period. In 1928, the year of his murder, and I think we need to call it what it was a murder. He did not simply fall asleep, as was reported. In 1928, despite the division of the diocese in 1922, membership was back to where it had been in 1908. He had rebuilt the diocese. Diocesan governance had been reformed and reorganized with an executive council following a plan of the General Convention. And he was known as being one of the very few great preachers in the American Episcopal Church. Yet, within a few years, William Alexander Guerry was a forgotten man, and also forgotten how he died. Why? Bishop Guerry's progressivism was well known around the state and certainly in church circles. While always loyal to the faith of the church, wrote the editor of the diocese, his mind was open and he always looked to modern developments of thought, not without fear, but with hope through that them would come a deepening understanding of revealed religion. He always stood for progress. When he was convinced that any proposition gave promise of some betterment or development in the life of church or society, he could be counted upon to espouse it with all his strength. But, and it is a very big but, in South Carolina and in the Episcopal Church in the first quarter of the 20th century, there were certain ideas about progress that were taboo. Since 1706, when South Carolina first had a black majority population, the vexing issue of race was the 800-pound gorilla, boulder, elephant, whatever, take your choice, in the room, whether the topic be politics, business and industry, education, or religion. And race was certainly an issue within the Episcopal Church in South Carolina. There were contentious debates in diocesan conventions between 1876 and 1892, literally at every diocesan convention. The question, should black congregations be admitted into union with the diocese? No. Should black clergy be allowed to a seat in convention? Eventually, the answer was no. During this debate on the seating of a black member of the clergy, former Governor John L. Manning wrote a pamphlet in which he lamented the color phobia that seemed to have overtaken the diocese. And you need to remember that John L. Manning was, before the Civil War, one of the great planters of South Carolina. We're not talking about somebody who came in from Spartanburg County. We're talking about one of the landed gentry. And that was his comment, the color phobia that seemed to have overtaken the diocese. And in 1889, the convention voted for a separation of the races within the diocese to be entire and complete by creating a colored convocation that would meet separately. And in 1892, officially established the Archdeaconry for colored churchmen reporting directly to the bishop. It was in these fraught years that William Alexander Guerry, the son of a priest of the diocese, was ordained as a deacon in 1888. He was 27 years old. And throughout his ministry in this diocese for the next 5 years, he served churches in Mars Bluff, Florence, Marion, Darlington, and Kingstree. He was ordained a deacon in 1891. Now, as a deacon, Guerry was not entitled to either seat or voice in the convention, and thus he was not a participant in those momentous actions that I mentioned earlier. Within a year, he was ordained a priest, and in 1893, he left South Carolina for a teaching position at the University of the South. He was to be chaplain and professor of homiletics and pastoral theology. In 1907, he was elected bishop coadjutor, and upon the death of Bishop Capers, became diocesan. In the 14 years since he had been away from the state, several things happened. Ben Tillman had been elected governor. Violence was widespread. In 1906, Charleston was number 2 behind Memphis as the murder capital of the nation. In fact, in real statistics, the number of deaths, there were more murders in the city of Charleston in 1906 than in the city of Chicago, which was considerably larger than the city of Charleston. Accused murderers were rarely convicted, and if there were, compliant governors usually issued a pardon. As bishop, William Alexander Guerry did not shy away from controversial topics. In his 1910 address to what is now called the Council instead of the Convention, he emphasized the unity of the church for all of God's children. At the following council in 1911, he spoke at length upon the subject of episcopal supervision of the church among the Negroes. And like the Diocese of North Carolina, he favored the election of a black suffragan bishop in South Carolina to minister solely to black Episcopalians. A committee was appointed to consider the plan and report to the next council. In Bishop Albert Sidney Thomas's history of the diocese is the following. There was much agitation in the diocese over this question that the bishop had raised, and that was an understatement if there ever was one. Secretaries can kind of make things sound, they don't really put the discussion. Discussion was held. Okay. In 1912, the bishop set forth in strong terms his approval of the plan recommended by the committee. A majority of the committee approved the plan, but the council resolved that this council is not in favor of the election of a Negro suffragan bishop at this time. In word and deed, as a proponent of the social gospel, Bishop Guerry very much reflected the spirit of today's Old Testament lesson from Isaiah, who was called to reach out to the poor, to the brokenhearted, to the captives, to the prisoners, to the other of his world. And that's what Bishop Guerry did. He certainly reached out to those Isaiah mentioned. He also did his best to reach out to the true other in South Carolina, the African American population. Interestingly, during the first part of Bishop Guerry's episcopate, South Carolina enjoyed a period of relative progressivism, at least in terms of civic and community improvement, in public health and in politics. But the state's progressivism was for whites only. But after World War I, things began to change. Black Carolinians who had supported the war effort and fought to make the world safe for democracy were bitterly disappointed. And I need to mention here that Bishop Guerry and Bishop Findlay both were chaplains in World War I with the troops overseas in France. A statewide convention of African Americans met in Columbia to protest voting barriers and the segregation. They asked for better schools and representation on school boards. In May of 1919, there was a race riot in Charleston that left 3 black Charlestonians dead. There were fears in towns that there might be trouble elsewhere, and it was a tense summer. The 1920s saw the rise of the Ku Klux Klan across the state. The Klan was against everything it deemed not 100% American, and in the South that meant blacks, Jews, and Roman Catholics. The General Assembly ousted longtime USC donor and alumnus August Kohn from the Board of Trustees because he was Jewish. In Florence and Greenville, there were indications that local law enforcement and the Klan were in cahoots. The Speaker of the South Carolina House of Representatives, John K. Hamblin, hosted a barbecue for the members of the General Assembly at the Klan's headquarters in Columbia. While respectable whites might disparage the Klan, many shared its view on African Americans. For example, Congressman James F. Burns, who refused to join the Klan, said, "The war has in no way changed the attitude of the white man toward the social and political equality of the Negro." Bishop Guerry's disdain for the Klan was well known. So was his support for programs such as Voorhees that benefited black Carolinians. James Herbert Woodard, a non-parochial clergyman of the diocese, was supportive of the Klan and had expressed his dismay of the bishop's belief in the social gospel. On June the 5th, 1928, Woodard met with Bishop Guerry in his office. The priest shot the bishop and then turned the gun on himself. Bishop Guerry lingered for 4 days but died of his wounds on the 9th. The death of the bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of South Carolina was national news. But after the initial coverage, it's as if a switch had been flipped. Local knowledge about the murderer's Klan associations and his outspoken racist views were not mentioned. Instead, he was now described as demented. That, by the way, is the line still used in Guerry's biography in an Episcopal dictionary of the church, where the murderer was described as a mentally disturbed priest. Charleston and the diocese seem to have collective amnesia about the death of Bishop Guerry. Why? Was it an embarrassment about the murderer's motives, views shared by all too many others, including lay and religious clergy leaders of the diocese? Was it a PR decision at a time when Charleston tourism industry was just beginning a much-needed income boost to the city? I mean, after all, if a bishop were not safe in his office, what about New Yorkers wandering the streets of as yet unrehabilitated downtown Charleston south of Broad? Or was it a concern that continued discussion of the tragedy might encourage others to support the bishop's views of the social gospel? Further discussion would certainly pose a threat to the established order. And as a result, the story of the Right Reverend William Alexander Guerry became something akin to a situation described in the hymn in honor of our ancestors. That's from Ecclesiasticus, chapter 44. Let us now sing the praises of famous men, our ancestors and their generations. The Lord apportioned to them great glory, his majesty from the beginning. All these were honored in their generations and were the pride of their times. Some of them have left behind a name so that others declare their praise. But of others there is no memory. They have perished as though they had never existed. Now, after decades of silence, the name of William Alexander Guerry will live on generation after generation because the assembly has declared his wisdom and the congregations proclaim his praise. Amen.